Hi, everyone. My name is Rudo Kemper. It is a pleasure to be here at the 2023 Canadian Open Data Summit. I regret that I could not be there in person this year, but it is a pleasure to be able to share with you a little bit today. So my talk is titled, Who Owns the Map Data? Indigenous Data Sovereignty and Digital Mapping Tools. But before I dive into that, maybe just a little bit about myself. As I mentioned, my name is Rudo. I am an open source software developer and geographer. I am based in Toxinant, which is now known as Springfield, Virginia, in the United States. I'm originally from Curacao in the Caribbean. I've spent the past decade or so supporting Indigenous and really other kind of remote local communities in mapping and monitoring their lands. I have experience working in the Amazon basin in South America, in Canada, in the Caribbean, and East Africa, and especially as of the pandemic and onward, providing a lot of remote support for communities globally, ranging from the Solomon Islands in the Pacific to other parts of Africa, Latin America, and North America as well. I have a slew of affiliations, but I won't go through all of them. But just to tell you about the first three, I am Senior Tech Lead at Conservation Metrics. I am the founder and one of the core maintainers at an open source project for mapping Indigenous oral histories called Terra Stories. And I'm on the board of directors at Native Land Digital. And I'll actually be telling you about all three of these and work that we're doing about Indigenous mapping later on in this talk. But maybe just to start with an opening reflection for folks who have not worked with Indigenous communities before, or at least not on this subject matter. Why do Indigenous communities want to make their own maps, in particular digital maps? So I've had the fortune of working with a number of Indigenous communities over the years and have benefited from learning their perspective on this question. So I would like to share with you a few of those perspectives. So this is from a community that I worked with in Colombia. And the quote here, I'll read it, goes, "We carry maps of lands in our heads. We elders have always had these maps. We need a way of putting them down for others to see." And so the insight here is kind of, we never needed maps. We've always had our own internal kind of maps. We started to need to either draw them on paper or digitize them as a way to get other people that are not part of our community to understand what our land looks like. So actors from the state or nonprofits or anybody else, businesses, anybody that's coming in to do some kind of activity in their territory. And this one's a little bit more pointed from Ecuador on the same subject matter. The state comes in and shows us maps of our territory, but we don't recognize them. Their maps are empty. Our territory is full and alive. Their map is not our territory. So kind of along the same lines, right, of creating maps as a way to help others understand what the territory looks like, but a little bit more pointed. In this case, this was a community that the state gave out a concession for petroleum kind of extractive activities in their land, and basically only really had concession boundaries, and it had none of the, kind of indigenous knowledge or place names or anything that the community themselves has about their land. None of that was visible. And I think it also kind of speaks to a broader dynamic, which you see everywhere, right? When you go on Google Maps or OpenStreetMaps or whichever mapping platform, if you zoom in on Indigenous territories across the world, frequently they are empty. They don't show any of that kind of local knowledge. And if you do see some place names, they might be colonial place names, like a mountain range that has been named after a former prince or king or something like that. That's changing a bit, but generally speaking, maps of Indigenous land tend to be empty, when for Indigenous communities, their lands are incredibly rich and full of knowledge that they have. This one came from a community that I worked with in Suriname, and I'll tell you a little bit more about what Terra Stories is later on in the talk. But the quote here goes, "With our Terra Stories map, I can just look at the map and listen to the words of my elders, and I immediately know where I come from and what it means to be a Matawai," which is the name of the community. So here, they're using a map which is a specific kind of digital map that embeds cultural knowledge in the way of storytelling, but it could also just be place names, right? There are many kind of maps that Indigenous communities have made that are just composed of place names. And rather than it serving an external purpose of educating outsiders or fighting back against maps that have been made by outsiders, this is internal, right? This is a way for the community to learn from the map, to use it as a tool for pedagogy, for understanding, the meaning of the land and the significance and the cultural storytelling that exists about the land. So much more of an internal. So then moving on, briefly, what is Indigenous data sovereignty? So there's really a lot to say about this. It's really kind of a rich and emerging area of both scholarship and research, as well as just awareness among Indigenous communities about the importance of having sovereignty over their own data. And I recommend looking into the work of the Collaboratory of Indigenous Data Sovereignty, led by Dr. Stephanie Carroll at, I believe, the University of Arizona. But here's just one definition that I'll be working with that I really like from the State of Open Data, which I believe is produced by the same group. Indigenous data sovereignty refers to the right of Indigenous peoples to control data from and about their communities and lands, articulating both individual and collective rights to data access and to privacy. So a few key points here: data that's about the community and their lands, as well as from the community and their lands. So it might be something that was produced by them or that was produced by somebody else about them, which is something that very often happened, right, in the history of, say, a field like anthropology or geography, where communities were visited by a researcher and data was taken from them in order to write a dissertation or for whatever purposes. And at some point, the community loses access over that data, right? And that kind of goes to the second part of this quote here as well: collective rights to data access, so always being able to access the data, and to privacy, so deciding that if the data really shouldn't be touched by anybody except for community members themselves, they should have the ability to do that, right? So that's really what I want to talk about in regards to then geodata and digital mapping, and whether those same principles apply in a lot of the available commonly used digital mapping platforms. So in the digital space, right, Indigenous communities are starting to take advantage of some of the same tools that many of us have used for digital mapping. And the question then becomes, in the usage of those tools, what does Indigenous data sovereignty look like in regards to those platforms? So I'm not going to go through all of them or talk at length about each of these platforms, and certainly there's more, but I would just like to name a few examples. And just to say that these are also tools that can be really wonderful and powerful for all kinds of reasons, including for Indigenous communities when they are used in the right way. And the intent is not by any means to say that they're bad tools or that they shouldn't be used, but just to review the concept of Indigenous data sovereignty in regards to them. So this one here is a story map by Esri on the ArcGIS Online platform. I actually worked on this one myself. I did the kind of cartography and design for this one, produced by a community, Sarayaku in Ecuador, where they were using this to tell stories about kind of extractive activities that are taking place in their land. So this is a very popular kind of format where you can do a map-based linear narrative telling stories about something that happened using maps. Another example is Google, so Google My Maps in particular, but there's also Google Earth, and Google has a couple of other different products. But a lot of communities have used this in particular for a map like this one, where it's not very cartographically sophisticated, but it's a lot of data like place names, or, you might have kind of audio recordings or just different narrative stories about places. So this is another popular tool that a lot of communities have used. And this one is a little bit different, but quite interesting. You have OpenStreetMap. If you're not familiar with OpenStreetMap, the platform itself, you're probably familiar with the data that is often used by a lot of other tools like Mapbox, or many tools that are used that are created with Mapbox. And what I find interesting about OpenStreetMap is there's a lot of Indigenous data that's on there. So what you're looking at on the screen here is actually an Indigenous village in Brazil, where I haven't been to this one, but I've been to one that's similar to it. And the kind of huts of the communities are in this circular shape. And then there's a central area, which you see in the middle of this map, and one building, which is kind of for ceremonial usage. And then, land use of kind of crops and planting that goes on around it, as well as little paths. And a lot of Indigenous communities have data on OpenStreetMap, whether they know it or not, because it's a common kind of practice that, it's an open mapping platform And so people often go in and find imagery to be able to draw new features that have not been kind of created on OpenStreetMap as of yet. So this is kind of another interesting example of Indigenous data on an open platform that many people use. And sometimes Indigenous people do use it to make their own maps and the like. But yeah, it's kind of another interesting one that's sort of out there that's commonly used for Indigenous mapping. So what are some of the limitations of these platforms? They're great, right? They're wonderful for storytelling. They're easy to use. They plug in with existing tools that we might already be using. You know, a lot of people use Google Drive, for example, or have seen story maps and are inspired by them, or use data on OpenStreetMap. So what are some of the limitations when it comes to, again, Indigenous data sovereignty? Well, you've got insufficient control over a whole bunch of things. So data copyright, this really pertains to licensing and the specific licenses that some of these, especially the corporate kind of platforms, have over the data that sits on their platform. It often has a clause, and Google is perhaps the most notorious in this regard, of if the data sits on the platform, then Google has the right to republicize it, to share it with third parties, and if it's public, to create derivative products about it, or perhaps to use it for different purposes that Google may decide. So there's often a copyright issue, right, of who actually owns the data, and are you as a community fully in control over the data, or are you ceding some of your copyright to the company that hosts your data, right? Access to data over time. So this, again, kind of goes to more to the enterprise products like Esri, perhaps. Licenses may expire. So you may have your data on one of these platforms, and it may sit there for some time, but if you stop funding your access to those platforms, then you may also lose access to the data. The same thing, I think, would apply to Google if you exceed your drive limits and all of a sudden you lose access to a part of it because you're no longer funding it, right? Determining permissions. So many of these platforms do have some way of determining, this is private data, only I have access to it, or I can share it with maybe a few specific people, but it's often not very granular. What I mean by that is it tends to be like one or all. So either I alone have access to it, or maybe my organization, for example, in ArcGIS Online, or everybody, and then the public has access to it. And often communities need a little bit more than that to be able to really practice data sovereignty and saying, no, it's only these specific subsidiaries or stakeholders that should have access, and to be able to take it away if needed. Where the data lives, this kind of goes back to the second point to some extent. If you're using a lot of these platforms, the data is sitting on their servers and you don't really have control. So if you want to create your own private server to use with these products, it's either very difficult to do so, it requires a lot of IT skills, or it's just simply impossible. And that's often a deal breaker for a lot of communities that want to own the actual premises upon which their data is stored, right? And then, yeah, data quality. This really goes kind of to the last point of OpenStreetMap, where data is being created. Remember the definition of Indigenous data sovereignty, where it's regarding data by or about communities and their lands. There's data being created about communities and their lands that they are frequently not consulted about, or their consent is not obtained when it comes to drawing out those areas in OpenStreetMap, for example. And yeah, so there's a lack of control over that whole process, and that can be somewhat benign. If it's just like a few features in a village, a few buildings. But what if it's information that the community doesn't want to reveal? Or what if there's a risk attached to revealing that information? What if it's, for example, in the Amazon, you have communities that are living in voluntary isolation that intend to not be found by anybody from the outside. And you, as somebody who's mapping on OpenStreetMap, don't really know that, right? There's no way for you to know what kind of features are consented by communities to be revealed or not. And so there's all these kinds of like thorny philosophical questions that have to do with that. In addition to the data could just be plain wrong when it comes to data quality, right? There's a few other kind of like side points here. There's dependency on a lot of things, dependency on the internet. That's really important for a lot of the communities that I've worked with that are in remote areas, that they don't want to be dependent on the internet to access their data. because the internet is either non-existent in some cases, like very deep in the Amazon. That's changing a bit now with Starlink kind of emerging everywhere. But it's still the case and it can still fail, right? Or it can be really expensive, or just simply they don't want it to be on the internet. Like philosophically speaking, they don't like the idea of their data being sent somewhere that's completely outside of their territory or the country. And, they have to depend on this very nebulous thing called the internet to access their data, rather than it should just be right here in our community, right? That's also kind of a limitation on Indigenous data sovereignty in its own way. There's also a dependency on external support, which is really interesting and often not discussed, but the fact that a lot of these platforms do to some extent depend on somebody being there to help out or help set it up or help maintain it or take data off when things go wrong, or if you need to evacuate your access to the platform. There's that kind of dependency that's baked into it, which if the community doesn't have access to those external resources, may also be something that alienates them from their data, right? And I've already kind of mentioned this, but just lastly, tools are costly, especially when using commercial products. So the data itself, even if it may be kind of kept in a good way, the tools to be able to access that data can be very expensive, which for kind of resource scarce, communities may be a barrier to accessing and maintaining their data as well. So in its own way, can also be something that goes against their kind of sovereignty over their data. So with all that said, right, the question that really has interested me throughout my career, as I personally have had a hand in working with a lot of these tools and trying to tinker with them and trying to see if they would work for communities offline or, in remote areas and help them maintain Indigenous data sovereignty, and kind of finding these limitations, the question that I, as a kind of technologist, started to ask was, if Indigenous communities can have a hand in co-designing their own digital mapping tools, will that help overcome these limitations and lead to an increase of data sovereignty? And then, thinking to the theme of this conference as well, and can the data be opened up, but done so responsibly? So, like I said, this is really the question that has kind of guided me a lot of my career and a number of the projects that I've worked on. So what I'd like to do now is share with you a little bit about a few of them that I mentioned earlier on in this talk, and really framing this around this question of data sovereignty. So the first one that I'd like to talk about is TerraStories. So what is TerraStories? It's an open source digital mapping application that was developed with this community initially as a piloting partner that's shown on the map, a community called the Matawai in the country of Suriname. And the Matawai, like many communities across the world, Indigenous communities and other, were really interested in preserving their place-based traditional knowledge and really just oral history, right? And right now there's this kind of 21st century phenomenon where a lot of the people that have the most extensive knowledge and memory of oral history tend to be in their 70s and 80s. And a lot of the younger people that have been exposed to modern technology or have needed to leave the villages to go look for work are not around to be able to continue that transmission of knowledge as it always had been with oral histories. So you have this potential loss of knowledge that can occur. And in particular, place-based knowledge, a lot of it has to do with, the surroundings and the forest and sacred sites and historical places. And if that information is lost, then people kind of lose that access and that kind of intimate connection that they might have with their lands, right? So in 2018, a small team of volunteer developers started to work on a tool called TerraStories, which is alive and thriving today. And it's intended to be used by communities to map and provide access to place-based oral histories. It was particularly designed to be kind of interactive and fun to play with, so that younger people in the community, like kids and teenagers and young adults, can get a lot of use value out of it. Like it's something that's exciting and fun to play with. And it's been used by communities across the world. So it started in the Amazon, but there's a very active project actually here in Canada with the Haudenosaunee community of 6 nations in Ontario that are using TerraStories to map kind of cultural knowledge and history and archaeological sites even, and just all kinds of knowledge about their lands as a way to educate community members, but also to be able to share with the public. Because part of what a lot of these communities want to do is also be put on the map, right? They want to do so, but to do it in a way where it's done in a responsible fashion and they have control, as I mentioned, over what gets to be shared. So with Terra Stories, long story short, there's a lot I could say about Terra Stories, but I'll actually just say a few things as well that I forgot to mention. So it's built in such a way where you can decide who has access to it, right? So you see here the story, Terra Stories with For the Matawai has a little lock next to it. So Terra Stories is built with a credential system where you can determine as the administrator who has access to what extent on your Terra Stories account. So which stories can be seen by which people. You can build that out in a relatively granular way, and then maybe sift through the series of stories that can be shown to the public. So there's a public login as well. And it works offline. You can self-host it. You can have it online if you want to. There's lots of ways that you could use it. Recently, we built out something called Explore Terra Stories. And that really came from this interest that communities had in saying, well, of course, we are using Terra Stories for our own internal purposes. And we're using that for education, during community sessions where we look at stories together and kind of review them. But we also want to open up some of our Terra Stories to the public so that, these 10 stories that we have right here that are kind of our maybe creation stories or something beautiful that we wish to share. And again, to be kind of put on the map, these we do want to share such that anybody could just take a look at them without needing credentials or access. So we built this interface called Explore, and it's opt-in, so communities can decide to use it, or they don't have to. They can keep their Terra Stories entirely to themselves. But if they do decide, then there are a series of stories that they can set to be browsable, findable using Explore. So this is an example from the Wayana community in Suriname, who are very active users of Terra Stories, and they have selected a few dozen stories that anybody right now, if you go to explore.terrastories.app, you can go check out those stories, and they were put in control of being able to decide which of those stories should be viewable or not, right? So again, going to that point of data sovereignty, it's data that was created by them, and they have the ability to decide who has access and what should be kept private. So next, I'd like to talk about Native Land Digital. I think a lot of people are familiar with Native Land Digital because it's a website that tends to go viral a few times a year, usually around Indigenous Peoples Day, or in the United States, Thanksgiving, or Columbus Day, which is now also called Indigenous Peoples Day, and typically anything that celebrates either colonialism or, is intended as a counter to colonialism. This website often circulates, right? And it's a really interesting project. It was started in 2015, I believe, by Victor Temprano, who was a developer based in Vancouver. And he became really interested in kind of mapping historical present extent of Indigenous communities and where they resided and do reside still, as a way to bring representation and visibility to Indigenous lands in places where there tends to not be a lot of discussion or awareness, right, about that. So it started as just in Canada and kind of North America, Turtle Island, but now it's really spread globally. And we have, and I say we, I'm on the board of directors. I'm the only non-native board member. And we have wide representation across South America, starting to map more in Africa, Southeast Asia, and other places as well. And a lot of people are familiar with this view of native land, of just like the map or the data somehow, and the fact that you can kind of search, your own address or location, and that then brings you to, the communities that are intersecting, so that you have an awareness of, oh, in this case, I searched for Curacao, and the two communities that intersect are Taino and Caquetío. And many people use this to do things like land acknowledgements, or just to spread awareness about, hey, these are the communities that, historically or present day are aware where I currently live, right? But what a lot of people don't know is there's actually a very sophisticated kind of back end to native land, and a lot of data and research and community input that's gone into native land. So for each of the shapes that you see on the map, there's actually a whole page, like this is one example for the Anishinaabe Netweki community, where you can see, different websites or tribal resources, and also the kind of source history of the maps as they've been produced. So what knowledge has gone into creating these shapes that you see on the map, whether it's existing archival maps or community input, as well as a change log. When were these things updated and so on? And what a lot of people definitely don't see is the kind of work and effort that the native land team puts into updating these and doing so responsibly. So native land has a research team, and we get many, many kind of comments and corrections and input from community members who often say, we'll provide input of, oh, I've seen the map, it's great, but it's missing this little part of our boundaries here. Or here's an additional research you might consult, to be able to update the map. And so there's a tremendous amount of kind of internal knowledge and process that goes into ensuring that the data is accurate. Insofar as it's data about Indigenous communities and their territories, it should be, again, the data quality should be accurate, right? And communities should have control over deciding what should and should not go on the maps. So we have a great research team that works on a weekly basis to update the maps and to ensure that the engagement from communities is well reflected in that which is output to the public. Another way in which we kind of open up the data after it's been put on the map is we do have an API that has been used by a lot of different developers around the world, different applications that are leveraging the use of native land data in their tools. So this is another way in which we open it besides, having the main map.